So hello, Dr. Sohom Das, and welcome to the show. Thank you so much for agreeing to come and chat with me today about a subject that I have been interested in for such a long time. Would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Casey, for having me on. Great to meet you a few weeks ago at CrimeCon. My name's Dr. Sohom Das. I'm a Consultant Forensic Psychiatrist, which means that I assess and rehabilitate people who've committed fairly serious offences, anything from sexual offences to arson to even murder. And I work in prisons and in courts and in psychiatric units. And I'm also a fledgling YouTuber.
Have your own channel slash podcast. Do you want to let us know a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's called A Psych for Sore Minds, and it is a smorgasbord of topics related to true crime and mental illness. So sometimes I do kind of big celebrity cases, like I've done a video on Ghislaine Maxwell recently and how she's going to deal with 20-year sentence. I've done stuff on Tim Westwood, on the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp trial. And then sometimes I get into cases that are not as high profile, but are still quite interesting from my perspective. So people that have committed serious offences that might have been, hearing voices at the time, for example, and I talk about the medical legal aspects. So there's a whole different range of topics related to criminality and mental illness as well. Something for everybody on my channel. Go and check it out.
Absolutely. I will post a link in the episode description. A Psych for Sore Minds, great play on words as well.
Two puns in one sentence.
Two puns in one. And when me and my partner drive through like small towns and villages in the UK, you often get those like small independent shops that have like really good punny names. And we're always trying to compare which ones are the best. So A Psych for Sore Minds, when I told my partner that, he was like, that gets 10 points. So
go on then, tell me what's the best pun shop name that you remember?
Well, his favourite one is hairdressers that we saw called Curl Up and Die.
Okay, yeah.
My favourite one that I saw was a dry cleaners called Pressed for Time. So they're the two kind of front runners at the moment.
I think I have to go for Curl Up and Die because it's got two puns.
Yeah. So were you always interested in going into consultant forensic psychiatry? I feel like that's quite niche.
Yeah, it is. The honest truth is no. So I think I was always interested in criminality. Ever since I was a kid, when I was like a teenager, I listened to gangster rap. I'd watch all these mob films. I watched like all these karate and violent films. So I've always kind of been interested in that culture, but I never realized that there's a field of medicine which specialized in it. And then I went through medical school. So there's often a misconception, psychiatrists are doctors first, and psychologists tend to specialize only in like emotions and the mind. So I had to do all of medical school, didn't really have a plan, did a psychiatry attachment when I was a medical student in my final year, and I immediately clicked with it. I think because it was just fascinating talking to these people that had such bizarre experiences. So I would, for example, talk to people with schizophrenia who would have these paranoid delusions about being poisoned or being followed or people wanting to hurt them or kill them. Or I would see people at their lowest ebb. So people who would come in post-suicide attempt. And I really felt that what I lacked in book knowledge in every other field of medicine, I made up for with like my empathy and communication skills. So to my surprise, I had a knack at it. Before then I didn't really click, or I wasn't particularly skilled at any other field of medicine. So, I immediately was attracted to it. And then whilst I was doing my psychiatry placements, once I qualified as a junior doctor, I did a placement on a medium secure unit. So that is like a locked psychiatric ward for people with a high risk of violence who committed anything from, stabbing, assaults, sometimes even murder. And again, I felt another connection. And I think it was the backstories that really drove me. So every single person that was there was something in their history. It was either drug abuse, poverty, being the victim of physical or sexual assault, or having really lax, neglectful parents. So there was something that explained, first of all, why they got a mental illness, and secondly, why they ended up as offending. So that's what drew me in. It's the origin story of the patient.
Wow. So when you said that the psychiatry is medicine first and psychology is emotions, you are kind of talking a little bit about how the emotional side of it does play a part for you in your interest in this particular area of work.
Yeah, that's right. There's a massive overlap between what forensic psychiatrists and forensic psychologists do. In fact, within these medium secure units, there's always a psychologist on the team.
Okay.
So they have more time with each individual patient to sit down and really talk through and unpick all of their emotions, their emotional scars, their incidents from their childhood, at least an hour a week, and also group sessions. So they're the ones that do all the really hard emotional work. Whereas psychiatrists like myself, we kind of oversee the team. We do things like, discuss medication, we section people if necessary. So our roles there's an overlap, but they're also quite distinct as well.
So how long were you in training for before you were fully qualified and able to kind of offer consultation in your own right?
Sure. So I became, there's different, there's a hierarchy of different roles or ranks, I should say, of being a psychiatrist or any doctor, actually. So you've got your sort of senior house officers, your registrars and consultants. So once you're a consultant, you're completely independent. You don't answer to anybody. You don't have a boss. So I became a consultant in 2014 and I started medical school in 1998. So that is, I'm trying to figure this out now. Yeah,
don't do it.
Almost 20 years. Long time.
Yeah, time goes so fast. I'm just shocked. The other day we were talking about what years certain films were released, and absolutely horrified, because I was like, oh, that was 6 years ago, and it turns out it was like 15 years ago. So now that you are doing your own consulting, do you have anyone that's under your wing? Can it work that way?
Yeah. So as a forensic psychiatrist, there are different environments. So when I very first qualified as a consultant in 2014, I spent 2 years in a secure unit, and I had a huge team of people. So I would have a junior doctor, psychologists, as I mentioned, social worker, a few nurses on the ward, occupational therapists. So we would sit down for ward rounds at least once a week, and I would direct people. And basically, they're all kind of independent, but I'm the one that the psychiatrist is the one that takes full responsibility. So mine is the name that's on all the discharge letters. I have to sign off leave and medicate when they finally leave hospital. So they all do their little bits and pieces, but the psychiatrist is the one that's ultimately responsible for them. Yeah. But nowadays I work mostly in court. So I do work with some junior nurses, and they screen the patients first. And if they are ill enough that they might need to be sectioned, then they escalate them up to me. Right.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense to myself. When you talk about section and things like that, I'm not sure that everybody will understand what that means. I worked on a secure unit for a few years with adults with schizophrenia, but it kind of doubled over with dementia, which I don't know if you find that to be common as patients with schizophrenia get older, but these were all over 70. So complex needs, cognitively and physically. And there was one person on the unit who was responsible for, we could take the individuals that were allowed to, someone allowed to go for walks because they were a danger to themselves and others.
Yeah.
There were a number of individuals on the unit who, with enough staff members, you could take them for lunch or take them shopping. And they would have to be signed out by the person in charge of the unit. And I was thinking, because one day one person did try to run away, and I was thinking, if that person isn't found again, or they are harmed, or they harm somebody else, that the person that signed for the individual to have the day out is going to be in so much trouble. So you take a lot of responsibility on yourself.
Yeah, and the title is actually responsible clinician. That's what they call the RC, responsible clinician, and it almost always is a psychiatrist. Yeah, you're right. You do take responsibility when things go wrong. When there's and it's a serious investigation report, then the psychiatrist is the one that's kind of, I wouldn't say blamed. I'd say that's the wrong word, but it's the one that the focus of the care is on. And if you get lurid kind of newspaper headlines, so once in a while we have people who are released from psychiatric hospitals who go on to reoffend, go on to commit some very serious, horrific murders. And it's always the psychiatrist that's kind of named.
Oh, gosh. So it comes with the territory then.
Yeah.
And one of the things I found really difficult on working on this particular unit was that you would have, those leadership roles or those people in charge. Sometimes they were registered nurses. It wasn't always the same profession that would take the lead of the unit on the day. But depending on the age of the person or how long they'd been in the field, it was often difficult to work with people who were kind of stuck in one way of managing things.
Yeah.
But as somebody that kind of became fully qualified in 2014, have you seen a lot of changes with things like, I don't know if there's been any amendments at all to the Mental Health Act, or how people are supposed to approach mental health as a subject? Have you kind of noticed those changes, and do you have to adapt as you go?
Yeah, good question, Casey. I think probably the biggest and most significant change that I've seen in my career has been that, unfortunately, due to a larger amount of people who A, become mentally unwell with serious mental illness, and B, offend, the threshold for getting into hospital has actually gone higher and higher over time. So before, when somebody was relatively unwell, so let's take schizophrenia as an example, if they were hearing voices, if there was an element of risk, they would almost always be sectioned unless they wanted to come in voluntarily. So either way, they would be hospitalized. But over time, unfortunately, there's been so much more pressure on beds. So the patient load has increased for each individual mental health team. And also there was this huge push by the government, by the healthcare service a couple of decades ago now, to get more people out of hospital and being looked after in the community. And I totally get the rationale behind that, right? Because that gives individuals a lot more freedom. They're not, staying in a foreign place, they're staying with family. So in theory, it's a really good idea, but actually in practice, it's a good idea for a huge number of people, but there's a smaller proportion who can't cope in the community. So I've seen loads of cases where there's people who have been a bit unwell and a bit risky. So to be specific, they might be having paranoid delusions about their neighbors. They might believe that random people are pedophiles. These are all examples of cases that I see. So they might be attacking people. And it's such a struggle to get people into hospital now. And even when I section them from court, to actually get a bed is just a massive uphill struggle. But so many services don't have enough space. They have to discharge the least unwell person from their unit, and it's not necessarily well, they're just the least unwell to make space. So that's something that I've seen change the threshold to get people into hospital. Nowadays, unfortunately, loads more people are coming through the criminal justice route. So they might have been sectionable, in my view, 2 years ago. Right. They weren't sectioned because there's not enough space in the hospital. So they were just discharged to the community, possibly medicated, might have become non-compliant with their medication, and they become more and more unwell, more and more dangerous, end up committing some sort of violent offense, and then get sectioned in the forensic unit, which is just tragic for everybody involved, not just the victims, but the actual patients themselves, because they could have been helped earlier. So that's a constant frustration that I see on a daily basis now.
Yeah. And what you said about, needing to make space by helping the least troubled patient or service user or individual to reintegrate back into society, there's a whole load of things that need to be in place for that to happen, including, round the clock support. And the health and social care system in this country is on its knees as well, with the staff turnaround at an all-time high. And so it really does sound like it's a difficult process throughout the entire cycle, which is interesting to get your perspective on. For any other people that are looking to become consultant forensic psychiatrists, your route, is that the easiest route into it, or would you suggest other ways?
That's the only way in, really. To be a psychiatrist, it's different if you're a psychologist. There's a few different sort of entry paths, but to be a psychiatrist, you have to do all of that. You have to go to medical school. It's possible to do it quicker than me. So I didn't know what I wanted to do straight away. So I did a year of surgery in Newcastle, worked as an ITU doctor, didn't click with me at all. Then I went to Australia for a bit, worked out in A&E, and it's good for my sort of general medical education. And hopefully, if I remember any of it, if there is a situation where my patients, for instance, all my parents, when they have a medical emergency, I might have absorbed some knowledge from that. But I suppose the point I'm trying to make is it can be done quicker than 17 years if you go straight into psychiatry and don't faff around trying other things first. Yeah.
Okay. And what are some of the most notable experiences you would say you've had since becoming qualified?
So there's quite a few that strike me. Should I give you an option of a few stories? And
okay.
So we've had all of these are fresh in my mind because I've written about them recently in my book. So I can either tell you about the most kind of emotionally shocking and tragic case that I've seen, or I can tell you about the sort of most gruesome form of self-harm that I've seen a patient commit, or I can tell you about a case where I think I'm fairly convinced that despite my evidence, a con artist faked mental illness and managed to get her charges.
Oh yeah. Tell us about that one. Oh my goodness.
Okay. So in my book, I call her Darina. That's not her real name. I anonymize all the patients that I talk about out of respect for the victims and for the perpetrators themselves. So Darina was a Ukrainian woman. She was very attractive. She was an ex-model. She was very rich. So she was married to a CEO and was a multimillionaire. They lived in Knightsbridge. And she was in the process of divorcing him. And basically she and two co-defendants committed this £1 million carbon credit fraud. So the two co-defendants were her cousin and a man who was her ex-boss who she had an affair with. And they did the vast bulk of the actual conning. So they committed most of the fraud. Darina just kind of washed the money. So she moved the money around various accounts.
Okay.
So basically what happened is all three of them were caught, all three of them were tried. And during the trial, Darina's son, who was only about 3 years old at the time, actually had a very rare form of leukemia and he was really unwell. He didn't die, but he was like on the cusp of death. And so for very reasonably, the court stayed her trial. So they kind of separated her bit, and the other two. They ended up going to prison. And then Darina was retried about a year later. So at this point, her son had made a recovery. So her son was in remission, but he was still potentially very unwell. So he could deteriorate rapidly with very little warning. And basically, Darina refused to engage in the court process. So she did not answer any phone calls from her solicitors. She didn't answer any letters. When the solicitors finally did speak to her, she just cried profusely and she refused to answer any questions. So she was assessed by a forensic psychiatrist, not myself, but quite a renowned professor in forensic psychiatry.
Okay.
I'm not going to name him because I don't want to commit career suicide, but I will say that his names are on the spine of all my textbooks that I bought and I haven't yet read, but I probably will one day. And I think this man was completely duped by Darina. So he was kind of overcome by her tearful presentation and he took her at face value. So when she said that she was too distressed to remember any of the details of the allegations, he believed her. So he found her unfit to plead. So then he puts in his report and the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, I think don't believe it. They smell bullshit. So they instructed me to do another second opinion assessment of Darina. And I thought right from the offset, there was something that just didn't quite add up for me. I didn't think she was being truthful, frankly. So I'll give you some specific examples. She was quite passive aggressive and quite difficult to assess. She was very dismissive. She was able to recall some aspects of her life. So when you take a full psychiatric history, you explore the childhood, adolescence, traumatic events, relationships, family history, all of that stuff. And she was able to answer those questions. But when I asked her about the offence in the entire period of time, remember before her child became unwell, she was unable to answer even the most basic kind of questions.
Oh, okay.
So she was unable to even tell me that it was a fraud case, let alone the details of what she alleged to have done. She couldn't, and then I specifically asked her if any of the co-defendants were related to her, obviously with one being a cousin. She said she couldn't remember. I asked her if who the name of her boss was, the other co-defendant. She said she couldn't remember, and it doesn't stack up to me.
Right.
You work for somebody for years, you have an affair with them, but you don't remember their name. So I was fairly convinced that she was basically exaggerating. She was faking being more depressed than she actually was. As a side note, I should say that I think she paid a private psychiatrist to write a letter saying that she had depression. The reason I think she paid to do it was because I read the letter and it didn't list any of the symptoms or criteria for depression. It just said she was depressed and too upset. So anyway, fast forward a few weeks after I put in my report, and we both, myself and the other renowned forensic psychiatrist, went to court, both sworn in to give evidence as expert witnesses in this case. And I, politely explained that I didn't think, I had to pick my words carefully. You never call a defendant a liar.
Are you on opposing? Gosh. Okay.
Yeah,
That's a bit, that feels like a bit, oh gosh. All right.
It's a big part of my job when they call me in to give oral evidence. And it was even more intimidating because I'm against this.
Of course.
And I I didn't say that I don't believe Darina, because you can never use that language in official evidence, but I kind of said there seemed to be a disconnect between what I think her ability is and the ability that she's displayed. There doesn't seem to be any psychiatric reasons, even if she did have depression, that would explain her not being able to remember. So basically, that's what you have to do as an expert witness. You can never speak the full truth, but you can kind of very strongly indicate what you're really thinking. So that's what I did. And then the conclusion to this story is that, to my amazement, the judge overruled my evidence and went with the other expert. So he didn't listen to me. And I'm fairly convinced, I can't say this for definite, but I'm fairly convinced the judge knew what was going on. So what I think happened was that they'd already had the two main defendants. And I think that it wasn't a good look for them to be sending somebody to prison who had like a really sick child. And just to kind of do a bit of damage limitation, I said in my report, there might be humanitarian reasons to drop the charges, like, because she's got all these issues and because she's got a very sick son, but there's no psychiatric reason. And I suppose what frustrates me about the whole situation is I think the judge used, just like Dorina did, I think they used her mental illness as an excuse. So if he had said, I want to stop the trial for humanitarian reasons, I would not have had a problem with that. But I think that I think there's no way that he couldn't have accepted my evidence. I think he just did that because he didn't want to go through the trial, and it was the easiest way out.
Oh, that's a tough one. A lot of Dorina's behavior, I feel like you can compare and contrast it to some leaders in high demand groups, some of the methodologies and tactics that they might use. It sounds kind of similar to an ongoing case at the moment where the writer of Grey's Anatomy is being accused of faking her cancer diagnosis. Have you heard about this?
No, don't know.
Well, I think it's in the kind of public eye at the moment. I don't know too much about it. I just read a brief article the other day, but it sounds quite similar. Somebody that might know how to work the system and have sort of maybe friends in high places, because Knightsbridge is probably one of the most expensive areas of London to actually live in. So as soon as you said that, I was like, oh, so not just money, but like money.
Yeah. So I do wonder, and again, this is speculation, but I do think that her presentation and her background and her credibility had a lot to do with it. Like she was a very well-to-do upper middle class, possibly even upper class, pretty well-spoken white woman. I'm not sure if all defendants would be able to pull the wool over the eyes of the judiciary system.
Well, that's interesting. Thank you for sharing that with us. And what is the name of your book for anybody that might want to go and have a look?
It's called Into Minds. Actually, I do have a bookshelf up here. I don't just keep this written. Mine's behind.
There it is.
Into Minds, stories of murder, justice, and recovery from a forensic psychiatrist. So it's just basically like my professional memoirs talking about my most sort of shocking and gruesome cases.
It was great at CrimeCon to see the people with the indoor bookstore, and there were just rows of your book, and then there were book signings where people could go and sign their own books for people to buy, which I just thought was great.
Really feeds into my narcissism.
Yeah, which again leads us nicely into this next part. So what I was really interested in when we connected at CrimeCon was gaining a professional's take on the subject of narcissism, because that term, I feel, is thrown around so much in this day and age.
Yeah.
But when we look at cult leaders specifically, narcissism always plays a part into the charisma that the individual has and the way that they are able to build their following and retain the power and hold over their followers that they build. So when we met, I was like, perfect. I can invite Sohom on the show and he can tell us all about narcissism. So what types of narcissism are there? It's my understanding that there's more than just the term. That's sort of the umbrella with many different types coming off of it.
Yeah. So just a quick comment before I answer that. So narcissism, as you'll know, do you comment on narcissism on every episode that you do? Or is it
No, usually with the interviews, it's more about the individual's lived experience. So unless that person has been particularly close to leadership or those that are in positions of power, we wouldn't specifically focus on that.
Okay.
But there have been cases where we've had a couple of experts come on the show who would talk about the characteristics of cult leaders, with narcissism being one of them.
Yeah, I mean, narcissism is like a barn door obvious feature that most cult leaders will have, right? Because narcissism, as I'm sure you'll know, it's egocentricity. It's when the whole world revolves around you. You've got a very high inflated sense of self. You're very grandiose. So basically you're full of yourself. You think you're amazing. And what is more narcissistic than somebody believing that they're God, or believing that they're not necessarily actually the incarnation of God, but believing that they should be praised. So that's the vast majority of cult leaders, right? So that's literally almost the definition of the term narcissism. But anyway, to answer your question, there's a few different ways to split it up. One of the crudest ways is adaptive versus maladaptive narcissism. So broadly speaking, if it's adaptive, it means that it helps you and it helps you fit into society. So that's the kind of person that's quite confident, that is very independent, that is reliant on themselves. So they are narcissistic. They're still quite grandiose, but they use it to their advantage. And they don't, I think the biggest thing I would say about adaptive narcissists, they don't inflict any inconvenience, discomfort on other people. Whereas maladaptive is where somebody's quite entitled, but it affects the way they get on with other people. So either they are so entitled or so grandiose about themselves that they lack empathy, or they don't care about other people, or sometimes it comes out in quite aggressive acts as well. So that's a really crude way of dichotomizing narcissism. But the other way of doing it is there's 5 sort of different types. So there's an overt narcissist. So that's somebody who is obviously a narcissist. So they're entitled, they're quite overbearing with their views, they're quite competitive. Again, they lack empathy. So I'm sure all of us have met people in our lives, a friend of a friend, at a pub, at a party, and you just think, this guy's a bit up himself, this guy's a bit of a dick. You know, they keep talking about themselves, they just show off. Basically, that's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about an overt, obvious show. So that's the overt type. Then there's the covert type, who might have some of the same kind of ideas and motivations. So they still feel entitled, but they're quite subtle about it. So they like to play the victim. So it's not, I am amazing, look at me, like an overt narcissist. It's more like, I am the victim and I've been wronged. So they tend to be quite avoidant and quite defensive. So they still look down on other people, but it's because they're a victim rather than because they're better than.
Right. Okay. Okay.
So there's 2 types. Then you've got an antagonistic narcissist, which is somebody who is quite cantankerous. Did I say that right?
Cantankerous, yeah.
Cantankerous, yeah. So they're arrogant, they're argumentative. So they're similar to the overt type, I would say, but they're the kind of person that's not just showing off. They're actually arguing with you. So it's the kind of person, again, I'm sure we've met people like this in our lives, who aggressively try and win arguments by making,
oh my goodness, yes, yeah.
really annoying points. And they might be right. They might be right in their arguments, but they do it in such a way that they just kind of go over the top, really. So they do anything to win the argument, even if they come across as a bit of a dick.
Kind of like beating you into submission.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Exactly. You've obviously met some of these, I can tell. And then there's a couple more types. There's a communal narcissist who, again, they're still entitled. I'd say all narcissists are entitled, but this is more about like moral outrage. So I suppose you could put some social justice warriors into this category. So they react strongly. They're really easily offended. So I would say that this is exactly what I see in Twitter. So when I don't know if I'm just following the wrong people, but when I look at Twitter, which is not that often, I see so many posts about somebody being offended on behalf of themselves or another group or a completely different group they don't represent. But it's almost like they get some pleasure in making complaints. Right. I think you might call them Karens in the States. Do you know what I mean? I mean, that's maybe perhaps slightly misogynistic because that suggests only women, whereas in actuality it's both genders. But they're the kind of people that, you know, they're offended on behalf of the whole population and they think that everybody else should be getting behind them. Right. So most people would just kind of roll their eyes and think that they're being a bit precious. Mm-hmm. And then finally, the last type are malignant narcissists. So these are people who are vindictive. So a bit like the overt show off, they have all the same traits, but the difference is they actually enjoy causing other people suffering. So cancel culture is a perfect example of this. So they will go out of their way they won't just be offended, maybe, you know, have a little rant and then move on. They will actually put in time and effort, maybe even money, into ruining someone else's life that they don't like, or they've had an argument with, or they feel offended by.
Wow.
There's kind of a high level of paranoia here. So they're very sensitive to being offended, and their whole motivation is to put others down or to dominate other people. Whereas the other type of narcissist might do that, but that's not their motivation. The other types of narcissists, their motivation is just for them to look better. Whereas a malignant narcissist, the motivation is to actually make others look worse, if that makes sense.
Right. Wow. So there's overt, covert, antagonistic, community, and malignant narcissist.
Communal, not
communal, sorry, narcissist.
Apart from that, you got all right. Did you do that without looking at your list?
Yeah, I was just I was writing down here.
Yeah. I couldn't do that. I couldn't remember 5 new words in one go.
Well, community is not correct, so I give myself 4.5 out of 5. How would we recognize in our everyday lives one of these types of? I mean, I know you gave some examples if you might meet someone like, say, covert narcissism, for example.
Yeah. So I think sometimes it's really obvious because these people are exactly what we talked about before. So they go out of their way to dominate the conversation. They always have to be right. They always have to show off, basically. So everything they talk about is some form of them showing off. I suppose with covert, it's a little bit harder to recognize. You might not recognize it straight away because you probably get fooled by them. So you probably think this person is a victim the first few times you speak to them, and maybe you help them with their cause, or you know, offer them emotional support. But over time, you kind of realize that they always like to play the victim.
Mm-hmm.
And you might say, if you start meeting them in a social circle, or they become your friend or friends of friends, then over time you realize that they've always got some sort of campaign and they always feel wronged.
Yeah.
And you might start to doubt the sort of veracity of some of what they're saying, right? Because you might have been present in a conversation, or I don't know, you might have been walking down the road and somebody said something that was a bit off, but it wasn't hugely offensive, and you've forgotten about it. And your narcissist friend is with you and they have the same experience, but they're really fixated on it. Like, they will not let it go. They will tell everybody they meet. They might start exaggerating aspects. So that's how you'd spot a covert narcissist.
Right. Okay. It's difficult when you come across people that might behave in that way, because if you become so desensitized by the person having issues and problems and coming to you for help and advice, or saying, you know, oh no, you know, nobody can help me with this. Sometimes I've had experiences where the individual themselves has actually found themselves in a problematic situation, and they've come to me for help, and I've been like, oh, okay, you know, I've been so worn down by times where I've tried to help and it's been sort of, you know, I've just been shut down every time, or even to the point where I'm wondering if they're telling me the truth. It came to light, you know, a little while later that the person actually did need my help. And it was kind of like the boy who cried wolf situation, where I don't know if maybe I didn't believe her or just felt like I couldn't help. So that was a really difficult thing for me as somebody who tries to be a good friend. Got to that point where I was just like, I don't know how I can help you, but she really did need help.
What I think the problem is that if it's truly, if the person's a true narcissist, then they don't actually want a resolution for their problem.
Right.
They're not asking you for help because they actually want a solution. They're asking for help because they like being the center of attention. That's ultimately what all narcissists are. They like being the center of attention. Having said that, it might be that you can actually help them, and your actions do help them, even if they didn't particularly care about or indifferent to the outcome of your actions. So you can, I suppose, even accidentally help somebody who's in a situation. But probably more often than not, they're going to ignore your advice, which can be quite frustrating, because why come to me and, you know, spend all this emotion telling me about your problems if clearly you're not listening to what I'm saying? So it is quite easy to become quite frustrated with them. And I don't know if there is an answer, really. You have to make a decision in your head about whether you want to keep being friends with them, or if you want to be friends with them, but sort of stay away from their drama. And if so, do you do that overtly, politely, or do you do that overtly by saying, look, I'm not going to help you anymore because you don't listen to me? Or do you kind of take a more subtle approach of steering the conversation away? So there's different ways of dealing with it, but none of them are ideal.
And in a familial setting, it's even harder, because a lot of the time it's not, you can't just say to your parents or your siblings, like, listen, I've had enough. So in family settings as well, I imagine that it's even harder to set those boundaries with people that are not allowing the spotlight to be anywhere other than on themselves. And it's me looking like at myself when you're listing all of these things, and I'm like, does the criteria apply to me? And I don't know if that's a good thing or if that's narcissistic in itself.
What, to actually question whether it
yeah, like
yeah, I don't think it's narcissistic to wonder if you're a narcissist, because that's just being introspective. That's caring about how you come across to other people.
You think that people that are narcissists wouldn't even question it because they would never apply, like, and never see themselves in that way?
I think they would have, what you're talking about is insight, basically. So I think most narcissists would have some level of insight, but they wouldn't think it's something wrong with them. So they would probably recognize, I do like being the center of attention, and I do enjoy it when people are paying me attention or talking about me. So they probably have insight for that aspect, but they might not appreciate that they're putting other people down, or they're not listening to their friends' problems, or they're not caring about other family members. That bit, they probably would be absent from their insight. Okay.
It's kind of like when people that are physically in and mentally in cult-like situations would never say, wow, I'm in a cult, because people in cults never think they're in cults. It's like a little kind of well-known saying within the cultiverse, I would say. So have you ever studied specifically a cult leader, and would you have a better way of explaining to myself and the listeners how we would be able to spot a narcissistic leader in our everyday lives, not just in TV documentaries about cults?
Yeah. So I'm afraid in my career, assessing and rehabilitating mentally disordered offenders, and also my expert witness work, I've not assessed a cult leader, but I've made a video about Tommy Robinson recently. Okay. So I think, even though I don't think, so he was a former member of the BNP and he was a former leader of the EDL. I don't think they're cults, but I still think I think they're cult-like. Some members are cult-like, and some of their beliefs are quite cult-like. And the thing that strikes me the most about Tommy Robinson, and I've talked about this in my video, is the number of lies that he tells. And not just lies, but how he manipulates the situation to try and come across as a victim. So I suppose this is he's probably both a covert and in fact, he's probably a lot of things. So he's covert because he plays the victim and he's defensive, and he's communal because he says that he's doing it on behalf of the community and the public, that he's standing up for the right of disenfranchised people that come from a certain background. But I suppose he's also quite malignant because he's also trying to pick fights and has literally beaten up on several occasions different people. So I suppose it's a bit of everything. But going back to what I was saying, so the reason I made a video was because he himself made a video in April that he put up on was it Twitter, I think?
I didn't even realize that he was still active and and around.
He calls himself a journalist.
Okay. So for anybody listening that doesn't know what the BNP is, that's the British National Party.
Yeah.
And I would say that they're kind of fascist, far right.
Yeah.
I don't know if you'd agree with that.
Yeah. I'd agree with that. Yeah.
I don't like to put labels on things too much, but that might give listeners an idea of what this particular party stands for.
Yeah, so they're a very sort of far-right nationalist party. So he was stopped in an airport in Mexico in April, and he said that he was stopped because it was a matter of national security and because he'd made some anti-Islamic statements in the past. But that's simply not true. He was stopped because there was a libel case and he was due to attend court, and he just skipped on his court hearing. So you can't travel if the UK authorities know that you're, I don't know if on the run's the right word, but at least if you've not turned up to court hearings, that's an offence. So you can't travel. Anybody would have been stopped, regardless of what position they're in.
What, do they just notify all the airports like this person's on the not allowed to fly list? What?
I don't know. I don't think. I think if it was for a really serious case, like if they were acute, like if they were a murder suspect, for example, then I think they probably would notify airlines. If it's something like this, I don't think they notify the airlines, but there's like a central system. So if the airlines decide to check then they would see that somebody's one.
Okay, interesting.
And the reason that he had this libel case in the first place was because there was a young man, an 18-year-old lad called Jamal Hijazi, who was beaten up really badly at school, and people took videos of this. And Tommy Robinson decided to chip in on social media, and he said that this person, the victim Jamal, had attacked a number of English schoolgirls in his school, which is completely not true. So they looked into this, and that was absolute fabrication. So the reason I'm mentioning all of this is that he's got a habit of just making up complete nonsense, complete fabrications to help his political agenda. As another example, he said right from the beginning that he is passionate about helping people who are the victims of abuse. And obviously there was a whole Rotherham scandal, and there have, there's no two ways about it. There have been men from a certain background, from a Muslim background, that have groomed women. That is absolutely undeniable. But he said that he's really passionate about those victims, and he wants to do something to help those victims. And then some members of the EDL themselves were arrested and imprisoned for rape, for exploitation, for sexual offences, and he was completely silent about that.
Right. Okay.
The whole point I'm trying to make is you can't be both. You can't be passionate about women's rights and protecting victims, and then it happens in your own organisation. You don't say anything about that.
Yeah.
So all of these are examples of Tommy Robinson presenting himself a certain way. So that's why I think his narcissism comes in.
Right. I think you're exactly right in what you said about how those parties, they might not necessarily be cults, but I think you can identify some cult-like methods that take place within those particular groups and groups on the left as well. This is not just restricted to me talking about the right. I know that anybody listening that knows me enough will know that I'm left leaning, but I mean just sort of the mentality around individuals that may align themselves either far left or right, because it all just goes around in one big circle. If you go too far one way, you end up on the other side. But even just thinking about Keith Raniere as an imprisoned cult leader, the founder of NXIVM, who would make up all of these grandiose lies about himself holding all of these records in the Guinness World Book of Records, and having all of these qualifications that nobody could actually prove, but took at face value. So everybody would, he claimed to have something like the world's highest IQ and was the smartest man in the world. And, he had such a huge following that nobody questioned. And when you say it so brazenly on a public platform, nobody has any reason to think that you'd lie. Why would you get up in a position like that and lie about yourself?
That can't be true, because I'm the world's most intelligent man and I have the highest IQ.
Yeah, maybe you should write him a letter and argue with him about it and see what he says. But I mean, I'm just drawing parallels there between what you've said about how we can identify some of those narcissistic traits in established infamous cult leaders, and that is just one person. There's so many different examples that I could give. Jim Jones, talking about the communal narcissist. He is somebody that was working to strip segregation in America, to stop segregation in churches. A large amount of followers and congregants of the People's Temple were Black, Indigenous, and persons of color within Jim Jones's movement. And a lot of his work was around trying to desegregate, and he was actually a part of changing some laws in America at one time or another. And it's wild to think that somebody that does that could go on to be a part of what happened in Jonestown. But now with your definitions, it's easy to see why that was just playing into his agenda. There were a lot of different established small Christian sects in Indiana where he grew up at that time, but there wasn't, because of segregation, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for people of color to be invited into these church houses. So, he grabbed onto that and was like, hey, if it's going to build the numbers, that's what we'll do here in this church. So it came across as quite progressive. He said he had a rainbow family because he adopted children of different ethnicities and from different parts of the world. But it's so easy after speaking with you to see why he did those things and how they would have just enabled him to build on the platform that he had.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we were going to talk about this in the list of questions, but a lot of what you're saying sounds like he might have been a psychopath as well.
Yes, absolutely. This is definitely something I wanted to talk about, because how can you instruct? I know that there was a lot of narcotics and drugs and paranoia, and well, I guess paranoia is its own thing in itself if we're talking about ill mental health. But
yeah,
with Jim Jones, how can you be responsible for the biggest mass suicide that America and maybe the world has ever seen? I know it was in Guyana, but the people involved were mostly a large amount of them were from America. And then even just thinking about Charles Manson and the Manson family, again with the narcotics, I don't know how much of a part that played. And we spoke at CrimeCon about how certain substances may bring on some types of psychosis or ill mental health. So yes, talk us through all of this stuff.
Okay, so what I'll do, Casey, I'll break some of that down. So I'll talk about what a psychopath is, and then what the difference between the similarities and differences between a narcissist and a psychopath, and then I'll tell you about drug-induced psychosis. So a psychopath is somebody. Also, all psychopaths are narcissists, but not all narcissists are psychopaths.
Right.
So psychopath is somebody who it lacks empathy, like a narcissist does, who's quite aggressive and quite impulsive. Narcissists aren't necessarily those things. They don't care about the rights of other people, and they never learn from their mistakes. So they're all those things, but what distinguishes them from other diagnoses or other personality disorders is that they're also really charming, manipulative.
Oh my goodness, okay.
And cunning. Yeah. Whereas narcissists, I'd say most of them are charming to a degree, or at least think they're charming, but not necessarily that manipulative. So that's the main difference between a narcissist and a psychopath, is that the narcissist is full of himself, really entitled, quite grandiose, loves showing off. Whereas a psychopath might be some of those things or most of those things, but more importantly than any of that, they manipulate others. So they see everybody as an opportunity to exploit for whatever that might be. It might be that they're a cult leader and they want infamy. It might be that they're doing it as a fraudster and they want money. It might be they're using it, for sexual partners. It might be that they're doing it for status, but they want something and they're willing to throw anybody under the bus to get that thing.
Or all of the above.
All of the above, yeah, absolutely, yeah. So even like people they're supposed to be close with, so even friends, sometimes even family members, because they can never really love somebody. They can be married, they can have children, they can show affection at times, but they can never really love somebody, because a true psychopath only really loves about themselves and only really cares about themselves, their own safety, their own future. So that is what a psychopath is. And that's what the difference between the two are. In terms of drug-induced psychosis, that's quite different, but that is when, so I very briefly explain what psychosis is. So again, this is something I think that gets conflated with psychopathy, two very different things. So psychosis is a state, psychotic state. It's different from your normal background self. So a narcissist is always a narcissist, psychopath is always a psychopath, whereas somebody who goes into a state of psychosis is usually temporary. And there are very specific symptoms. So the most common symptoms are auditory hallucinations, hearing voices, and delusions. So paranoid delusions. I think I mentioned some of them before. People are trying to kill me. People are trying to poison me. The FBI are following me. I've had a microchip implanted in me. These are very common things that I see in my patient group. The ones that I see tend to commit violence because of these psychotic symptoms. They need to be sectioned and taken to a specialist psychiatric unit. So drug-induced psychosis is where you go into a phase of psychosis caused by drugs. So really strong cannabis like skunk and amphetamines are probably the biggest kind of culprits. Stuff like heroin, alcohol is possible, but it's really rare to get into a psychotic state using those things. And unlike schizophrenia, for example, which is a recurrent psychosis, drug-induced psychosis comes on really quickly, like within minutes or hours of taking a substance.
Wow.
And it lasts for a much shorter period. So it usually lasts about 2 or 3 days, as long as it takes for that substance to leave your body. So obviously if you're going on a bender and you're taking drugs for, a week, then your psychosis is going to last for longer as well.
So when Charles Manson is gathering his followers or his family into a little circle when we're on Spahn's ranch, and he's kind of given them all tabs of LSD, but then he's not usually partaking in them. And then he's telling his family, I always say in air quotes, you know, that he is God and this is his vision about the race war and how the Beatles' White Album are giving him all of these messages. What would that do to the person that is experiencing the drugs at that time?
Yeah, I suppose there's right, because the very nature of acid, of LSD, most mushrooms, because they're hallucinogenics, there's a really fine line between just being intoxicated and just having normal experiences with those substances and actually being psychotic. And it's quite hard to decipher where somebody is sometimes, you know, without actually assessing them in that moment. But I would say that wouldn't necessarily tip them into actual psychosis. I think it's just getting them when they're really sort of vulnerable to your strange beliefs. So I suppose, to draw a parallel, if you wanted to do something stupid like run a trolley through a car park with your mates, if you ask them to do that when they're sober, the vast majority of them are going to say no. But if you ask them when you're all really drunk, staggering back from a night out and you know, you're yet to have your bad, then they're probably going to say yes, because not because they're psychotic, but because they're sort of disinhibited. So I would say that that's probably more likely that Charles Manson is making his followers, his family, I'll do the air quotes for you, making them more, I think, disinhibited rather than psychotic. So he's getting them when they're in a vulnerable state where their senses, what they're experiencing is already quite surreal and is already quite disconnected from reality, but still not quite psychosis. And he's feeding them with some very bizarre ideas in the background of them also, you know, having put in a lot of their faith and their belief in him. It's not as if he's just coming out of nowhere and meeting people for the first time, in which case they probably think he's a bit weird.
Well, no, yeah, and he's all of those things you said, you know, charming, manipulative, extremely impulsive, and would be presenting all of the personality traits that you mentioned that somebody that is a psychopath might exhibit. And the same could be said for Rock Terrier of the Anthill Kids, who called himself Moses. So that kind of tells you everything. But again, he would harm people physically in the most grotesque ways, which speaks to more of what a psychopath might do, physically harming people, not caring about their human rights or any type of rights. You could look at Keith Raniere with the Inner Circle of Nexium and the DOS program that he had and see those same things. You know, you could do that with Warren Jeffs from the new documentary, Keep Sweet, Pray and Obey. If people haven't heard of Warren Jeffs before, leader of one branch of the FLDS church, where he was basically marrying off young girls to older men because that was the currency of the realm. So, you know, that's how he made himself all big, almighty and all powerful, whilst allowing himself to carry out perverted things as well in that position of power. So there are so many different cult leaders that you can apply these psychopathic traits to, as well as the narcissistic traits that you mentioned towards the start of the episode as well.
Yeah. So obviously I can't say confidently without assessing any of them in person, but I would say that, I think I mentioned this before, you almost have to be a narcissist by definition to want to be a cult leader, because you're literally trying to convince a whole group of people to worship you, right? Wow. And I would argue that, I'm not saying that every single cult leader is a psychopath, but they certainly will have psychopathic traits. They might not have enough traits to actually get them past the threshold for a diagnosis, but absolutely they're going to be manipulative, charming. You can't get people to, you know, leave their jobs and follow you into field and convince you to possibly take your own life unless you're charming and manipulative, which is not possible. So they definitely have a lot of the tendencies. Yeah.
And you said you've just done a video on Ghislaine Maxwell. So would you say that she has psychopathic traits? Because I would say she definitely has narcissistic traits.
Yeah. Good question. I'm trying to think. So I don't know enough about her to confidently say.
Right.
She's absolutely narcissistic, very entitled, obviously comes from a very privileged background, treats other people below her like crap. I think that's quite fair to say. Is she charming and manipulative? I suppose she must be to a degree, to have got all these vulnerable women and put them in a situation where they're being sexually exploited. But then again, she does prey on pretty easy targets. You know, she was preying on very young women with this pretense of offering them like a future in the industry and become models, et cetera, et cetera. So I suppose my point is, I'm not sure how charming and manipulative she is, because, you know, she's already preying on people that are vulnerable, and she is quite credible. Where she was coming from she had quite a credible setup. So she probably does have some of the she probably does have some of the characteristics. Yeah.
Have you ever been in conversation with somebody where you've been able to say confidently that they are a psychopath?
Yep. So actually, I did a series of videos quite a while now on my channel about psychopaths, and in one of them I talk about a boss who I worked for, who I'm fairly convinced was a psychopath.
Oh, it's scary to think that I know that not all psychopaths would be dangerous, but from what you've listed, thinking about people that have gone on to commit multiple murders, I was just thinking about Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy and all of those traits that you were listing off around psychopaths. I was like, this is why serial killers are, called psychopaths. And then there's the whole conversation around nature and nurture. So then when you think about perhaps just being in the supermarket and somebody next to you who's looking at, the same tin of beans or something is potentially a psychopath, that doesn't mean that they're necessarily going to be dangerous, but it's still quite scary.
Yeah, it is scary. So it's a really, really well-known fact that psychopaths tend to do quite well in the corporate world. So psychopaths are overrepresented in CEOs for the same reasons as we discussed. They're willing to throw anybody under the bus. They're willing to do anything to get the promotion. They're willing to lie, willing to talk shit about their colleagues, even their own friends, behind their backs, if it helps them get a job or get a promotion or obtain a position. So just really briefly, I'll tell you about my boss and why I thought he was a psychopath. So I have to say it took me a while to realize, like I was very charmed by him at the beginning. He seemed sort of really friendly, really confident, but I noticed that everybody else in the office, when I first joined, seemed to be terrified of him, and I didn't really understand why. It didn't seem to make sense to me. They would whisper, and they would stop conversations when he came into the room, that kind of thing. So it wasn't something really obvious that I could put my finger on, but there was just vibe around him. And then when I started working for him, I noticed that he would force his staff members, and even tried this with myself a couple of times, just to change things and manipulate things for his benefit.
Oh,
so
okay.
It was for a housing charity, and he would not be present in some meetings only because there were so many meetings he couldn't go to all of them. He would ask for the minutes of those meetings, and he would actually change some of the things that were being said in those meetings, even though he wasn't there, and then sort of upload them onto the system without telling anybody he did this. And it took me a while to realize he was doing this, and he'd been doing it for all along, doing it for years, and other staff members knew but were too sort of scared to say anything. As another quick example, he had lots of different people in the office working on the same projects, but he wouldn't tell anybody intentionally project.
Oh,
get
okay.
Get something to do another bit, get something to do another bit. I believe because he wanted ultimate control and power.
Yeah.
He was doing what? He would do completely random things like hire people, myself included, I think, who without any kind of process through HR just decides, I want this person. I want a psychiatrist that makes our foundation look more credible. Just hire somebody like me without an interview process, without even discussing it with HR. Put them on the salary on the payroll, like just because he wanted them in the organization without doing any of the kind of protocols or processes. So that's just another example. What I'm trying to say is whatever he wanted to do, he'd do it. And if anybody had any opinions that were different, he would either ignore them, force them out, or just change their opinions on the paperwork. Yeah.
That is so in line with a lot of leaders that we speak about on the show as well, in terms of, just breaking up marriages and repartnering people, like for no reason, just because, they're having a bad day and they decide that they want to flex their ultimate power by dictating exactly how people will behave on that day. Just kicking people out of the group for the most minor things, and then not allowing them contact with their their family and their children, and everybody shuns them, and it just sounds so familiar. It's really fascinating, and I wonder if there's been any specific research on it. Maybe there's a thesis idea, who knows? My mind's just running wild now. Well, how would you find if there was research around this?
About psychopaths in general?
And cult leaders and...
You know what? I'm definitely the wrong person to ask, Casey, because I get sent psychiatric journals by the pile every week, and I've not opened one for like 8 years, so I can't even keep on top of my field.
So What is next for you in your career? Are you kind of happy and comfortable where you are and you're just going to kind of continue on this journey? Or do you have any ideas of where you would like to go in the next few years?
So I think, to be honest, with my forensic psychiatric work, with like, my proper day job, I'm fairly happy with it. I'm getting a constant stream of work. I'm very sort of fortunate in that, apart from my actual appointments, like prison appointments and court appointments, I can tailor the rest of my week around my work, which means that I get up ridiculously early, get up at 5 o'clock usually most mornings, just bosh out a few hours, and then I can take a few hours off in the middle of the day, go to the gym, hang out with my kids. So work's just perfect, really. It's really settled. I don't want to change anything about it. My new kind of passion, interest, obsession, crushing disappointment is trying to make it on YouTube, I think. So that, and I'm trying to break into the media world, which is also quite frustrating and slow. But that's what I want to do, I think. So I am trying to get onto documentaries. I spoke to this morning, actually. I might be on This Morning next week, which is quite nice.
Oh, that's very exciting.
And the thing is I don't count my chickens, because I've been in a situation where I've been told I'm going to be on X, Y, and Z, and then they pull through the moment. So I'm trying not to get too excited until I get that final call. That's
great. That's great. And usually when I get approached by a documentary team or a TV station, it's because they've listened to an episode that they really enjoyed and wondered if I could put them in touch with the individual that I interviewed without crediting any of my work or sourcing their own guests. And there's me, just little old me, sitting here, I'm playing the victim. Little old me on my own, trying to do all this stuff myself.
Sure you're not a covert narcissist?
I know, I think I might be. I was kind of falling into it there, and then I caught myself. So, In Two Minds is a book that Dr. Sohom has written, and it is published, and you can get copies of it now. I'll put a link in the episode description to where you might find that book. A Psych for Sore Minds is the YouTube channel that you can also find in the episode description. The videos are not like these interviews. They're not really long, mammoth, really just taking up your whole time episodes. They are shorter installments, super informative, really concise. I've listened to a few and found that I was able to talk to my partner about a couple of things. And what I really liked about a couple of the installments that I watched on your channel is that you were taking suggestions from your audience as well. And not everybody takes the time or space to do that. And one last question I had, Sohom, before we say goodbye today. Why are cults usually led by men, do you think?
I think perhaps there's two reasons that immediately jump to mind. One is because a lot of them are to sexually exploit members. So we see so many male cult leaders who basically use their authority and their standing to sexually abuse younger, usually quite naive, quite vulnerable females. And it's not, as we know, sexual abuse is far more commonly committed by male perpetrators because the sex drive's higher. There's lots of sort of biological reasons, probably an overall lack of empathy. More men than women are antisocial in terms of their personality. We know that more men in general commit crimes, non-sexual crimes as well, sort of aggression. So I think that's one big issue. And I wonder if a lot of it's got to do with insecurity as well. So I think that probably roughly men and women, when they grow up in their earlier experiences in childhood and adolescence, have an equal incidence of feeling insecure for whatever reason, whether they're bullied, whether they are favored over another sibling in their parents' eyes, whether they feel they're not appreciated at work. But I think men are a bit more Neanderthal in the way they react to that. So they are more overt in doing something illegal or immoral about it.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's how they intend things to go when they start these journeys, but the way that they always end, I know it's not restricted to just men in these situations, but it's interesting to me, people that commit multiple murders, people that go on to lead cult-like groups and use these really abusive and exploitative methods. It generally 90% of the time is men.
All of that's true, but also 90% of the prison population in the UK is men, probably more than 90%.
That's
So
very
I guess,
true, yeah.
That's what I'm saying is I think that's probably reflective of general offending as opposed to being something that's more specialist than other types of offending.
That's great. Thank you, Sohom, for your insight into all of those things. I don't know if there was anything that you thought might be important or insightful to add.
Just in another shameless plug on my YouTube channel, some of the topics we've talked about, I've got videos on. So I've got a video on a Wu-Tang Clan affiliate rapper who had drug-induced psychosis and cut off his own penis.
Yes, I was wondering where I'd seen that. I was like, where did I see that? I saw something about the Wu-Tang Clan and a missing penis. It must have, right, okay, yeah.
And also I've got a whole series on psychopaths, a little bit old now, it's probably about a year or so old, but it's a whole series of psychopaths. I talk about some of my old cases where they've got a formal diagnosis of psychopathy. I talk about my ex-boss that I told you about and why I think he was a psychopath. So if you're interested in those topics, go check out those episodes.
Yeah, definitely. I do highly recommend it. Thank you so much for your time today. I know that you are busy, but I appreciate all of the conversations that we had at CrimeCon. Some were sober, some were after a couple of beers. All of them I enjoyed, and hopefully we'll get the chance to connect again soon. Will you be in Glasgow on September 10th?
Yeah, I will be there, Casey.
Amazing. I will see you there, and hopefully we can catch up then. But until then, thank you so much for all of your time, Sohom, and enjoy the rest of your day.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Casey. Thank you for having me on. Goodbye.
Bye.
Good luck with the podcast.
Thank you. You too.